Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I'd like to just spend 10 minutes talking about climate finance and the work that we've been doing on climate budgeting and trying to make a climate budget. And I'd like to thank the team at UNDP who we've been working with, and also through the joint SDG fund, and also ERI, the Economic Research Institute, who have done much of the work that I'm going to talk about this morning. So next slide, please. So really the presentation is going to be in three little bits. Firstly, why do we need a climate change budget? So we've put a lot of effort into trying to create climate change budgets. Why do we need them? Secondly, some simple ideas about how we can build a climate change budget. And thirdly, a little look at the sort of initial outcomes of our work on trying to create a climate budget for Kazakhstan. And I will just say that the budget that we've produced is from the central state budget resources. And so it's important to remember there are many different forms of climate finance that are flowing in. We focused on the government central state budget. So firstly, why are climate budgets necessary? Why should we go to the effort to producing them? Well, financing is necessary to promote action. We've talked about so many different ideas, from green hydrogen to reducing coal usage to issues on land use and agriculture. All of this needs money to create the action for change that we need. And climate change is a cross-cutting and complex issue. So it sits in many parts of the government, in many of the activities and actions that the government undertakes. And remember, we have mitigation, which is reducing net greenhouse gas emissions, but we also have adaptation, which is building resilience to the impacts of climate change. And these things interlink, and they are apparent across many areas of government. And if we can create climate budgets, it helps us to identify areas that are maybe weak or there's gaps in financing. I guess we're always limited on the financing, but the question is, where is it best to put the money you do have? Where do you get the biggest gains? For example, where do you get the biggest amount of carbon sequestered or not emitted for each dollar or tenge that you spend? So you need climate budgets to determine this side of the equation about how much it costs to achieve things. And thirdly, it can help support diversification of financial sources. Once you understand the money flowing into the climate response, you can start thinking about additional mechanisms for promoting additional finance. For example, through private sector support, creating enabling conditions, feed-in tariffs maybe for renewable energy, or you can promote different agricultural activities that are enhancing soil fertility as well as reducing carbon. So you can start to diversify aspects. Many countries, for example, are looking at bonds, creating green bonds or climate bonds as a way to put financing up front to allow rapid investment in the short term, to allow the benefits of carbon mitigation to be accrued over the subsequent years. And it's also true, as we see the example, a little thing here on country program guidance for the GCF. Some of the major donors are asking for climate budgets as a justification of where the country should be looking for further investment from the GCF. So it's becoming built into the system. Next slide, please. So how did we put this together? Well, we're fortunate enough that we, in the top diagram here, already had an ongoing effort into SDG budgeting. So we had a sort of an SDG budget from centralized state resources. And so what we did was we extracted out those SDGs that within the national context seem to be related to climate change. And this came to a total of about 2,396 billion tenge. But in a way, this was the ceiling of the climate budget. If this was saying if all expenditures within those SDGs were related to climate change, the budget would be that. But many of the expenditures were not related to climate change in these SDG areas. So we created what we called a strict climate budget. And this was the expenditures in those SDGs that seemed to be related to the climate response. And this budget was 534 billion tenge, about somewhere around there. And this includes a reduced number of SDGs. And you can see that in the third box down. And then in the fourth box down, we also tracked the SDGs and the budgets that would be related to the draft low carbon strategy that has been produced. And we find that that's somewhere around 425 billion tenge. So we've got this total climate budget, which is maybe the ceiling of if all investments under these SDGs were climate smart, it would be that. A strict climate budget where we see that most investments are related to climate change. And then also a low carbon strategy budget where the investments that we see are actually going towards the policy objectives of the low carbon strategy. And I'll talk a little bit now just about the strict climate budget. So this is the budget we think existing expenditures are linked to climate change. Next slide, please. So what's in the strict budget? I've told you the size of it previously, 500 billion or so tenge. Where does it go? Well, on the bar chart here, and we can see those three bars together are 2019, 2020, and 2021 budget. And we see that most of those are attributed to SDG 9, which is industry and infrastructure. So the largest component of the strict climate budget is going to there. And then we see SDG 6, which is water and sanitation, SDG 15, which is land, SDG 12, consumption and production. And then we have SDG 13, which is climate action. And it's quite common that the climate action actually is a small component of what's going on in climate change, because climate change is a cross-government activity, not just sitting within usually a coordination center for climate. And then if we look at the pie charts below, we see the breakdown of these expenditures between adaptation, mitigation, and adaptation and mitigation together. The light blue is combined adaptation and mitigation expenditure. So that makes up about 3/4 of the expenditure. And then we have about 1/4 of pure adaptation expenditure, which is the light green color. And then we have a very small slice here, which is pure mitigation expenditure. Now, within the state budget that we've looked at, mitigation expenditure is very small. This is because we expect many of the investments in energy and things are coming through different routes than the budget that we looked at. And this is when you think about climate budgets, we need to think about starting to layer on the different expenditures or budgets coming into climate. So we don't find much pure mitigation expenditure in our budget at the moment. Next slide, please. If we look at the strict climate budget in relation to the universal budget codes that are used in Kazakhstan, then we find that a majority of it sits under budget code 7, which is housing. So this is improvements in housing, communal heating systems and things like that. We see budget code 10, agriculture and environment, takes a fair bit, and then small amounts in fuel and energy, state service, industry, very small amount in culture, which we can hardly see, and then a bit in education. So this is how the climate budget links to the budget codes. Next slide, please. And this is our view of the low carbon strategy budget. So along the bottom axis, we've identified policy objectives of the draft low carbon strategy. And then we've allocated those budgets to those policy objectives. And again, we see that buildings, low carbon buildings are one of the major allocated areas in the budget. And then we see land, and then we see very small amounts of expenditure in energy, R&D, research and development, and education. And a lot of the existing state expenditure that fits under the low carbon strategy is related to land and land management and buildings. So the energy supply, electricity area is not coming up strongly within our budget that we have produced. Next slide, please. Creating one budget for 1 year maybe is not so interesting in itself, but it starts to become much more interesting as you track budgets over years. And people in many countries, as you see from the map, are starting to have this annual process of tracking budget. And understanding your expenditures, your allocations within the climate budget can be actually quite important to move towards a low carbon and resilient future. And the benefits of climate budget tracking include raising awareness of climate change, using finance as a lens to look at climate change needs, encourage mobilization of resources to implement climate change. You know, we've heard this morning about so many different ideas and options and opportunities for climate mitigation. They all need to be funded. So identifying the finance or the mechanisms for finance is very important. Climate budget tracking can also improve monitoring and reporting of the climate change process. It can help strengthen public financial management by further linking planning and budgeting between line ministries. So this is coordination within the state budget about who's doing what, who's learning, who's creating models for effective investment. It can also contribute to an assessment of effectiveness of the climate change response. As I say, effectiveness is very, very important because we're in a finance limited world. So where do you put your money? Do you put your money into green hydrogen, into reducing coal? Do you put it into land use? Do you put it into agriculture or forestry? What do you do? What's effective? We see a lot of the budget is linked to things that create both climate resilience as well as mitigate climate change. So this combines adaptation mitigation expenditure maybe is a very efficient way to go. So for example, planting trees can be considered as a mitigation action, but it also helps to hold the humus in the soil, which creates carbon mitigation, but also reduces the flooding events due to heavy rainfall, or reduces the pressure from drought, because organic soil helps to hold water in the soil. So you get both resilience and mitigation benefits, and moving towards a budget where you get multiple benefits for the same dollar or the same tenge being spent is very important. And finally, you know, the climate budget tracking identifies those areas that have been identified as priorities in national policy, which are not receiving adequate funds, and looks for alternatives to fund them, such as bonds, such as development assistance through the GCF, for example, or enabling private sector investments to be mobilized in those areas. So, final slide, please. So in summary, why do we need a climate change budget? We need a climate change budget because money is important for creating climate action. Secondly, we've shown how you can build a climate budget. We've used SDGs, but there's options for layering on other budgets from development assistance, private sector, to get a fuller picture of what's going on. And thirdly, what is in the Kazakhstan budget? We see that we have quite a lot of expenditures going to industry and infrastructure and into land, but not so much going into other areas, particularly into energy and electricity supply. But that maybe is reflecting the budget that we have created from state central resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for your presentation and for your contribution to our event. Just quick questions. Speaker, коллеги, участники, будут вопросы? Online?
Dear colleagues, dear participants, are there any questions? Maybe online participants have questions. Okay. Can you please use microphones? How the budget is created and who is managing that budget? Is it a question to the speaker? Yes, to the speaker.
Okay, so how is the budget created? The budget is created by going through the budget classification system at the level of the sub-functional group. So when you look at national budget documents, it is broken down into many lines of expenditure. So we take those sub-functional group lines of expenditure, and then we determine, is that expenditure climate related? Is it not climate related? If it is climate related, then we say, is this aiming for an adaptation output? Is it building resilience? Is it reducing greenhouse gas net emissions and mitigation? Or is it doing a bit of both, like that forest example that I said, where you can sequester carbon, but also reduce the impact of climate change, for example, flooding and drought. And so that is the level that we enter into the budget documents. Who is going to sort of take over and use the budget? Well, we're piloting this work such that the government, the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Ecology can take up the approach that we've used and potentially use this as a way to create an annual climate budget through climate tagging. So we've developed a way that this can be done. We've shown that it can be done. And as requirements, for example, in NDCs require the the climate finance to be considered. Green climate fund country plans require climate budgets. There's a growing need for this information to be used for informing development partners, but also for prioritizing expenditures within the appropriated budget of Kazakhstan. So there's sort of multiple purposes for it, but it's largely one lens, one view on the overall climate action in the country that the government can use to help strengthen its response and target finance into areas that there are potential gaps.
Many thanks, dear speakers of the whole session and dear participants. I suggest to wrap up this session because we are very much behind the schedule. If you have any additional questions, you can send us the written questions and we will forward it to the speakers and we will make sure that the answers will be provided. Now let's break for lunch. And I think 30-45 minutes should be enough. And then let's gather up together for the next session. Thank you. Presentations and the research works that are being conducted by various sites, including Nazarbayev University. And we will start with the presentation of Mr. Rocco De Miglio, who I myself know for many years. And during all of these years, like maybe 10 or 15 years, he's been already working with Kazakhstan. His presentation is about academic vision of the path of Kazakhstan to carbon neutrality. I assume that this is actually the part of work which was done a year ago, and it was presented on the 26th COP. Rocco, are you here?
Hello, everyone. My name is Rocco De Miglio. I'm an energy system modeler and analyst, and today I'm going to present the academic vision of Kazakhstan path to net zero carbon future. Now, this presentation is slightly different from the previous one. My colleagues, Aydin and Dauren, already presented some projections of energy and climate variables, which are basically the result of this research analysis, if you like. I would like basically to focus a bit more on three keywords that are in the title of this presentation. Academia, so academic, vision, and path, so trajectory, which is generally calculated with some kind of tools or models. So the goal of this presentation, rather than to talk about some future of Kazakhstan, is more to emphasize and stress the role of academia in the Kazakhstan path to net zero. And I'll try to explain why I believe this is pretty much important. Now, when we talk about energy and climate, and to create a vision about energy and climate of a country, in particular of Kazakhstan, we have to consider that this is a very multidisciplinary challenge. And university, and Nazarbayev University in particular, I believe is a good environment to deal with this kind of multidisciplinarity. Why? Because first of all, every time we deal with energy and climate strategy or vision or plans, we have to deal with data and statistics. I know there are several programs and schools in the university which deal with mathematics, for example, with data science. So this is one of the key components when we want to quantify the impact of energy and climate in the future. The second key pillar is basically technology. There are several courses about technology and engineering, and technology is one of the key components of any decarbonization strategy. So the idea of assessing, generating innovation related to technologies in the wide area of the energy sector, from the generation to the demand side, is critical. And again, this is a reason why an environment like university can provide good insights in the energy and climate vision. The third one is about policy and policy interpretation. Again, I'm aware of a program which is specifically about policy and a school of policy regulation. So the idea here is that it's not about numbers only, it's not about technology only, it's about to basically create some kind of instruments which trigger the innovation, which trigger the transition towards something which is green. Together with this, it's very much important to develop some tools. So again, softwares, computer programs which take into consideration all the complexity of the sectors and the correlation between the energy part, the agriculture, and my colleagues Dauran and Aidin have spoken about these sectors in particular, together with other sectors which are very much important to decarbonize the system, like, for example, transportation. So again, this idea of creating an integrated framework which can deal with all these kind of components is fundamental in creating a vision and then preparing a strategy. Other points of this multi and complex challenge: the identification of drivers and influencing factors. So this is basically the request of creating some kind of narrative and storylines which can put all together the forces which drive the transition. Again, I believe that knowledge about technology and policy and economics can be very valuable in basically setting the scene for this analysis. Obviously, the creation of dashboards and tools which facilitate the interpretation of this kind of analysis is very much important. This is a snapshot of a dashboard that I have created for the for the LTS analysis for Kazakhstan. Again, the idea to involve people who can basically make this kind of tools easy to use and clear enough to unveil synergies, to unveil insights is very much fundamental, and university can play a significant role here again. University is also an environment where the innovation in terms of programming can evolve quite a lot. Every time we talk about energy and climate vision and plans, we have to deal with some kind of uncertainties, and there are several techniques that we as modelers and analysts use to deal with uncertainties, from stochastic programming, Monte Carlo analysis. Again, I believe actually that experts in university, researchers are the right people to basically deal with these complex methodologies and try to transfer the insight of this complex analysis to decision makers. I've heard about this kind of word, risk, during the presentation that I was listening before during the day. So again, the idea of just focusing on a multi-criteria analysis is fundamental. The idea of considering just energy and climate to some extent is limiting the analysis. We have to be able to introduce additional elements, additional criteria, which actually matter in this kind of energy and climate transition. Risk is one of the analyses that actually can be bring into the table. And again, there are several techniques to deal with risk, and university is a good environment to explore risk analysis and transfer insights of this analysis. And the final point that I wanted to mention is to have a sort of vision which is supranational, because sometimes we are basically just focused on what Kazakhstan can do and what Kazakhstan can achieve. But basically what actually Kazakhstan can do and can achieve very much depends on also the behavior of other players. So to have a vision which actually looks at the components which are supranational, what happens in China, what happens in the EU, what happens in other players which are critical in the development of the energy and climate, is very much important. And again, the internationality of a university can bring quite a lot of value in this kind of analysis. So this is just to give you a panorama of the area where I believe university can very much contribute in providing a comprehensive and consistent vision related to energy and climate in Kazakhstan. Now, when we talk about vision, sometimes actually we make some not very correct identification and interpretation of the word. So in a very simple terms, I try to put there in this slide a distinction between the word vision and the word strategy, and why university actually has presented a vision while the decision makers are trying to prepare a strategy. Now, a vision in a very simple term is basically the forward-looking direction of a system. So basically we set a target, we try to move from point zero to that target, and we see basically backward how the system should be built to meet the target. So once actually we set this kind of looking forward, we approach the analysis backward from the target to the point zero and see how the system should be in an ideal world to meet that target. So basically Preparing a vision is specifying some quantitative thresholds that we want to achieve and exploring this kind of what-if analysis to some extent. Preparing a strategy is to some extent a sort of reality check of the vision. So the idea is to analyze the steps which are required to meet this kind of end goal. And as you see here in the second chart is again a sort of forward-looking, but this time is also a forward process. So we try to simulate and mimic some instruments like, for instance, policies, measures that actually can bring the system towards some points in the future. And we try to calculate the deviation from the point where this combination of instruments lead and the target that we have. It's very much important to say that generally a vision is the starting point, and then the strategy is to some extent a sort of second step of the analysis. But as an analyst and as a modeler, I would say that these two approaches are very complementary. So there is a lot of learning material when we compare vision-related analysis and strategic-related analysis to mutually basically improve and to mutually enrich with findings and insight about the feasibility of the vision and the target, and about the optimal mix of measures and instruments which can basically bring to the target with a very minimum deviation. Now, how we basically deal with visions to some extent and with complex strategies on the other hand. We generally use tools. Aydin has already mentioned one of the tools. What actually I can show you here is the multi-country system models, which I have maintained and developed in the course of these years. But what I wanted to emphasize again is the role of the universities, the role of my colleagues, Mr. Baygarin in particular, in Nazarbayev University, because the very first version of this model back in 2014 and 15 was developed in collaboration of Nazarbayev University. And this multi-country tool actually is the basis for the Kazakhstan specific model, which is then used for the LTS, for the national communication. So this is a knowledge which initially was developed in the framework of a collaboration with university, and then that I further develop and try to maintain in the course of the time. I don't want to bother you with all these techno-economic characteristics, if you like, and the specific information. Let me just say that for those of you who are a bit more familiar, that this tool is based on a dynamic partial equilibrium concept and paradigm, and is basically formulated and solved in mixed integer linear programming. So again, complex word, just to say that researchers are the right people, in my opinion, to understand, to further develop these tools, and to support decision makers in interpreting the outcomes of this analysis. Now, in the framework of a very important and popular concept of opening and making very transparent tools and programs and softwares, I decided to put this tool available for you guys, for students, for researchers at Nazarbayev University. So you can find an open version of this model, which was used back in 2020 on my GitHub page. GitHub is a tool, as you probably know, that actually is used to co-develop softwares and programs and also to store and share this kind of information. So for those of you who are interested, you can basically refer to this link and download the tool. To run the tool, you need some kind of softwares, but you still can learn quite a lot from this kind of tool, even by looking at the source files. And I will try to tell you why. So this is the page that I'm referring to. This is where you can find this open access version of the model. Here is a short description of actually what the model is, what is the coverage, and what actually you can potentially do with this model. And if you click here on this green button, you have an option to download the tool, and you can basically open the source code and navigate and make your first attempt to understand exactly how modelers deal with this complexity, how modelers organize this source of information, which is huge, and how modelers try to simplify the reality to explore future development of Kazakhstan and of complex energy systems in general. In this page, in this open access page, you will find a number of files here, which are basically input files for the model. The data are organized in Excel files, and then the model processes these Excel files in some sort of scripts, and then it passes this information to the solver. But you see here that every time you find a file with KZK, this is a file which is related to Kazakhstan and the information of Kazakhstan in 2019, 2016, so some kind of historical periods by sector: agriculture, power, industry, residential, upstream, tertiary, and transportation. So my suggestion, if you're interested, is to basically link to this page, download the tool, and try to understand what kind of data we are processing, what kind of information we are elaborating. This is the way to basically maximize the transparency and give your contribution to this kind of complex channel, if you like. The second folder and area that I suggest you to explore is basically under this folder, and it contains all the future options that we allow in the system. So basically future power plants, future options for space heating, future options for transportations. So we set a sort of basket of technological options that can be part of the mix in the future. And is subject to the model, and is subject to the optimization, is subject to the narrative of the scenario to see what kind of technologies are picked to form the mix in the future. Again, the idea is actually that you, as economists, engineers, analysts, special experts in policies, you can comment, provide feedback, and try basically to better understand exactly what modelers are currently processing, what actually are the gaps, and whether this kind of information can be improved and updated or made even more country specific. Because one of the main points is that many times modelers like to work with very generic databases, which are internationally good, recognized, but are not very much, viable for country specific analysis. So the idea is that you can basically have a look and try to provide comments and return feedbacks to those who are in charge of running the model. And this final slide is basically just to say that together with the base year configuration and the historical configuration and the basket of new options, modelers work with some kind of scenario levers, demands, for example, and policies. Like, for example, in this case, we are trying to mimic the measures which trigger the retrofits in building in Kazakhstan. So again, for those of you who are familiar, for those of you who are experts in the sector, you can try to see how and what kind of data are there to mimic this kind of policies, comment, and further improve. So it's a never-ending process to some extent, but it's very much important, in my opinion, that in this new world of open access approaches, students and researchers are very much involved with the expertise to return comments to decision makers. Another point that I want to highlight, instead of making a specific analysis of the outcomes of this model and this analysis, is just to tell you that the way you have to try to comment and the way you have to try to interpret the results is always in a comparative manner. Scenario per se is a standalone analysis, say few information and few, insights. But if you try to compare a reference case with a decarbonization case or a reference case versus an NDC case, here is where actually you can find the learning material. Here is where you can find the insights that actually matter and return comments to decision makers. And the key point of the analyst is to try to identify synergies and synergic behavior. Now, you see here that actually I'm trying to compare a reference case with a
Rocco, so there is 1 minute left.
Yeah. So just to say that it's very much important that you practice the idea of creating, of finding the synergies when you look at the results. It's not just, looking at the chart and accepting the data as they are, but it's to interpret them. Very much important to do that. There are several other elements that actually can be added to a vision. They interpret the issue of water, which is very much important in Kazakhstan, the issue about hydrogen. I know that these keywords have been mentioned during the discussion earlier today. What I want to focus as a very final point of my presentation is the concept of risk. Now, there are several ways to interpret risk. Kazakhstan has a very high exposure to a low carbon world, and there are several reasons why this exposure is very high. So as a further, let's say, contribution and cooperation with the Nazarbayev University, what I'm gonna do now is to use this complex tool to run a risk-based assessment. So what I would like to do is to create a multi-criteria decision-making analysis, which makes use of this complex tool and somehow capture risky configuration of the energy mix, and we incorporate this kind of mathematical expression into the model. The idea in the end is to create a multi-phase analysis, so something like this, which can basically easily tell in a trade-off curve to decision makers what is the extra cost that your system has to face to basically reduce of one step the risk. This is one activity that we are going to do together with Nazarbayev University in the course of the next months. I would be very glad to basically hear from you how this risk analysis can be interpreted and what kind of formulation of this risk analysis you would like to see, because we are very much open at this stage to identify the better interpretation of the risk assessment. Final, if I have the chance to, okay, final slide is, these are basically takeaways for the academic vision. Academy is the place where you can think out of the box. Do it, please. Academy is the environment where you can basically trigger the dialogue and the cooperation, and you can face the interdisciplinary and the transdisciplinary of the complex challenges. So try to basically maximize the synergies across all the expertises in the university. University is the place where actually it's very clear the difference between what is mathematics and what are decisions. So it's very much important that actually you can try to contribute the best of your knowledge to this very complex challenge for Kazakhstan. So I think actually I'm done with this. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
So next presentation. Kazakhstan is a country who started their own trading program, carbon trading program. So, and this is unique process in country and transition, and it will be interesting for us to know more about this. Ruslan Muratov, expert UNDP, can make it. Your floor is yours, please.
Good afternoon. We've done the work as a part of the UNDP project on supporting an auction mechanism to Kazakhstan ETS system. It was done together with Mr. Lewandowski, UNDP expert. The main focus of this work was that in our system, in our ETS system, there are two types of market, primary market and secondary market. And that was in the previous environmental code. And the primary code was described in more detail in the new code. That was like an auction. But as of today, there was not a single auction held. As part of this work, we analyzed not only environmental legislation, but also the stock exchange legislation and the rules of stock exchange. We have developed recommendations about holding the auctions. The code states that the amount provided for the auctions is taken from the fifth part of reserves. We have used the European scheme of trade as the basis. It was suggested that the amount for free of charge distribution, it was said that 5% does not mean that it is 5%. It is for review of all stakeholders. It can be 1% or 2%. This is the free of charge distribution. Every year this will go down, but out of but the rest should be done on the basis of auction, so not free of charge. It should be sold. So the fifth part from the reserves is suggested to be excluded, and the remaining part of the reserve distributed among the remaining four. The carbon unit trade rules and the model rules according of the current legislation, the auction order is described as a double recursive audit auction. There are two types of trade in the law. There are two types of such auctions. And these modes actually are not aligned with the auctions that we hold, because there is one seller and one buyer. It's not possible to do one single price for all the buyers. And here we show how these auctions are suggested to be held. On this slide, we can see, may I use a clicker, please? Well, let's see that there is a daily auction with the amount of CO2 of 100,000 tons. Every participant can suggest their own amount and the price. And when this scope is filled up to 100,000, it means that the deal is fulfilled. And it means that this price will be for everybody, and the rest will not be able to get the amount that they need. And if this point here that shows that this is the amount that was not purchased, and according to the law, that will be transferred to the next trade. We have described all these mechanisms in the recommendations, what amendments should be done to the environmental code and to the stock exchange law.
As I told you before, for the primary market, for the auctions, we need a separate regime for auctions, and the mechanisms for conduction of them should be also written, allowing to conduct, for example, we have one seller as an operator, for example, it's GST's Jasaldamo, for all operators of the facilities, for example. One of the important things is distribution of carbon units, and according to the current legislation, the shift from one period to another period is not allowed. And according to the recommendations of international experts, they proposed to allow this transfer or shift because it allows to have these allowances of carbon units to have them as assets. So they will have similar meaning to assets. Participants of the trading of this allowances units for greenhouse gas emissions, we have actually the operator, and for after having just operators, we also propose to have dealers who will be financial organizations regulated by National Bank, and some brokers as well.
Дополнительно мы прописали, что предлагается, что
for the secondary market, we also propose to have some changes to legislation or to regulation about it. So if in our legislation, the auction-based transactions are conducted, for example, at if the trading happened at 4 p.m., then the initiator of the auction has to once again announce this request if auction didn't happen successfully. But we suggest that it will, for example, last for 10 days or 7 days. So this is for the decision of the competent authority. If we can extend it so that those who want to buy it, they can have this long-term ability, so they may think about it and not have to every time to re-announce this request for the initiator of the request, and every time so that every time it will not have to be updated. So if there are any questions, I'm ready to answer the questions. I'd like to add that this climate talks is significantly changed in terms of its content and quality, and the biggest share of academic presentations today is an indication of these changes, and this corresponds to that situation that we also had in our climate, all other climate talks in the world. So positions of the scientists and researchers should be impacting the decisions we're making. That's why we have several professors from Nazarbayev University on today's climate talks. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kanat. Thank you to all of you who stayed in the late afternoon for the session. As I said in my introductory talk during the panel, so my focus is on geoscience solutions, or here we call Decarbonization Geo Solutions as a key for successful energy transition in Kazakhstan. So my co-presenter is Saber, so he will join a bit later to the second part of a talk. So he's doing a study on mineral trapping. So because we have people from very different backgrounds here, I really like to make several slides about problem statement and something that we learn not only from human history but also from geological history. So we know now everyone is talking about Kazakhstan being among top 20 greenhouse gas emitters in the world. We know that anthropogenic greenhouse gases contributes to that rise very much, and we know that we made a commitment to reduce this emission. So again, I will go a bit to literature, recent literature stating sort of alarming effects of climate changes. So here we said, it says that 11,000 scientists warn of untold suffering. So basically what they are suggesting in this article here that humans may not survive. And the reason is very simple. There are only two reasons for that. The reason is CO2 emission and methane emission. And what is the cause for that? Basically fossil fuels and agriculture. So Kwanish today made a really great talk about contributions from agriculture that most of the people are not talking much about, but actually it's equal or not greater than fossil fuel emissions. And that this recent article now from this year that actually confirming possibility of eventual human extinction. So what does mean human extinction? Human extinction means that we as humans will not exist anymore. So it goes to these possibilities. So let's look just quickly in geology about some extinctions that occurred in the past. So we all know about mammoths. Mammoths lived across the globe about 10,000 years ago. We know that 10,000 years ago, horses were in North America as well, just they disappeared there. They didn't disappear in Asia, but they definitely disappeared because of climate changes there. What is less known, that only several thousand years ago, we had 3 types of humans, and only one survived, and these are sapiens. Why sapiens survived and other two kinds of humans didn't survive? Mostly because of communication. They established communication between themselves. And this communication is actually key for our success, that we avoid extinctions, which is potentially coming in the future. So this diagram here in green shows from basic evolution of the species throughout geological history. So in green shows diversity. So we see that today we have the most diverse number of species, but we also see that overall it was growing over time. But we had in this yellow shows kind of significant drops. So what is these significant drops are? They are mass extinctions. So what we know from these mass extinctions in the past? So we know that always the most advanced species disappeared. Right, so when we have the latest one at Cretaceous, when dinosaurs disappeared, and dinosaurs did not disappear as it's commonly believed by meteorite impact, they actually disappeared of climate changes, because meteorite impact caused a ash layer to cover the entire Earth for several years with no sunlight and so on, and some of these ash layers are superbly exposed in Mangistau region there. So it's mapped and documented very good there. So climate changes in all of these cases were the reasons. So the most advanced species disappeared. So today, who is the most advanced species? That's us. So we are the first target. We are the most vulnerable to that. And what we also know that once species disappeared, never reappeared the same species again in the history. So let's look now for the solution. So now these 11,000 scientists, and even more than 11,000 scientists, are telling us that planet is terminally sick. So I compare that with going to the doctor. The doctor tells you, "Hey, you look really good, you look healthy, and so on, but your result shows that you have cancer." Right? So essentially, Earth now has something that I would like to compare with cancer. And what doctor does then, to suggest two things: let's stop growing this cancer, or let's try to remove it. And the same solution should be applied for these two. So we need to stop reduction and to try to remove it. So with that now, I like to talk about these potential solutions. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank all my research associates for working with me. As what I'm showing to you in the next slides is not my work, it's their work, and they are really brilliant young people. They are actually solutions for the problems which are coming. Also, a number of my co-PIs here from SMG and NU, some international collaborators, local collaborators from several universities and organizations in Kazakhstan, financial support of many organizations here in Kazakhstan. So let's look now these decarbonization geo solutions. Basically, we can group them in three: nuclear energy, renewable energy, and carbon storage and sequestration. So where we need geo solutions, where geology is needed. So all of us know, okay, we need that for uranium, we need that for CO2 storage, and we need for geothermal. However, we also need for these three here, because these are systems for energy storage. As I said earlier today, sun shines when it likes to shine. Summer, but we need energy in the winter, so we need to store that, and all storage spaces are provided in this substrate. So what are carbon solutions here? So look at the subsurface. So saline aquifers, existing oil and gas fields, coal seams, deep coal seams, and there are number 6 there, which are a bit exotic things, like they are saying that basalts, and we will talk about basalts and other ultramafics in the second part of talks, because this is really cutting edge. So, but let's go one by one. So I mentioned uranium is first. So this is the map of uranium demand in the world. Also, Kazakhstan is not in demand because we are not producing any energy from there, but we are the biggest leader, and actually biggest leader in production. This production can improve significantly. So opportunities there is that we still don't know the play concept. We still don't know why this uranium mineralization exists in Kazakhstan. So there is a need for better scientific explanation for that, and there is lots of opportunities to improve reservoir efficiency, particularly acid losses, and also to produce rare earth elements as byproducts. So just last week I attended the conference, which was uranium conference in Almaty, and many people start looking now for these rare earth elements as byproducts. So I was talking before, I mentioned geothermal there, where we need solutions. So this is work from Ashur, and this is her work from Mangishtak region. So what I like to stress out here, so she selected 4 wells. These wells are from Mangishtak region, and look these numbers. These are geothermal gradients, means how much heat we have per kilometer going down. So 32, 35, 37, 39. So everything which is more than 20 or 25 is considered good. So now, not everywhere in Mangishtak is that. There are selected regions, selected tectonic blocks. But we know now, I mean, thanks to her work and work by Leila Karabayanova, we know exactly this system, why we have this thin crust and where we need to go for heat. So, but in addition to heat, we also need reservoirs. So we also know from this diagram in yellow there, that's where we have good porosity, good permeability, and this geothermal, wherever we are more than 120 degrees or even more than 100 degrees, we can go with commercial production right away. So in addition to that, there are this second well there showing kind of granite Paleozoic, that. So there is also possibility to do some fracturing, and we have some postdoctoral fellows who are working on that. So what is the problem now? Lots of this water is going out, like on this water fountain, without being recycled. Look now, Ili Basin. Ili Basin. So I'd like to stress out this one here. 3 kilometers depth. At 3 kilometers depth, we have absolutely fresh water, which is more than 100 degrees. So all scientists in the world, when we said them, we have a fresh water at 3 kilometers depth, they cannot believe. We did tests there that shows that it's fresh water. Why so important? Because in geothermal energy, the biggest problem is actually to remove brines, to remove oxidizing things. But we have all of that is basically given by Mother Nature. I said by Mother Nature. Vadim did an excellent study using isotopes there, explaining recharge system. So we know why is that there, but this is rather academic question. And so what we are doing at the moment is very wrong. We are going there. There is a bunch of these resorts with pools. All of them are actually using artesian water or pumping water. Nobody is repumping this water down to the surface. Basically, we are doing negligent formation damage there and losing this energy without possibility to say recover in long term. But I'm sure soon things will change, and some commercial projects can be there. So let's look now about CO2 storage. So this is Karaganda. We were talking earlier today about Karaganda being the biggest polluter in Kazakhstan, perhaps. And what is the solution for Karaganda? One of the solutions that Andrei Kalimov here, who is a partner on this project, is working on adsorption in coals. So we are mining these coals which are close to the surface, but when we go deeper in the subsurface, actually they can serve as a storage place. Even more, this injected CO2 can replace methane, which exists there, and methane is very cleaner energy source than coal itself. So there are efforts, and I'm sure that the industry will grasp some of these academic advancements in the near future. So in Kazakhstan, so I mentioned a couple of these basins, but actually we have 15 basins. Each of these 15 basins has abundance of reservoirs, abundance of good seal rocks, which are really suitable for CO2 storage. And now, what is CO2 storage in porous media? I mentioned this CO2 storage in coals, but in porous media is very simple thing. Every petroleum engineer, every petroleum student here in undergrad can do that. So it's basically find the reservoir in the subsurface that has porosity and permeability, put the well there, inject CO2 there, and of course to have a trap. There is a bit of engineering, of course, that needs to be done there. It's not to overpressurize this reservoir, to keep this cap rock, which is shown in gray, marked as impermeable seal, stable and so on. There is some engineering work, but all of this engineering work is quite routine. What is new and novel is that fourth concept, this concept called mineral trapping or carbonation. So what mineral trapping is basically CO2, which is gas, to be converted into carbon, to be converted into rock, into a solid. And this process occurs naturally. So here we see, for example, in basalt rock, the supercritical CO2, this white rock there, which is formed, this is actually CO2 which reacted with basalt. So this is actually thing that we are working now together with Saber, and Saber will show you some really exciting results. But we know also that there are many reservoirs, natural occurring CO2 in the subsurface that actually never mineralized. So it means we have to have something very, very special in these reservoirs for this to occur. And what is so special? So this equation may look complex, but actually they're very, very simple. So we show CO2 and then M2 plus. So M2 plus is either calcium or magnesium or iron. The only thing that we need to have are rocks which are capable to release these kind of ions. And what this kind, where they occur? They occur in minerals such as pyroxene, plagioclase, olivine, forsterite, and look, all of them release these ions. So if we have rocks like that, they can readily react with CO2, and we can create mineralization, as is shown on this diagram. So now, where this rock exists and why it's important to Kazakhstan, these rocks, this is kind of all kind of different type of rocks. We see there on the right side here, they are called ultramafics, right? And on the left side, we have granite, which is potassium feldspar, quartz, and so on. So these on the left side do not react. These on the right side react. What's the problem? The problem is these rocks are very, very deep down the earth. So they are not close to the surface like quartz and feldspar and granite, except in some cases. And okay, first, before I show these cases, these are actual mineral reactivity of these different rock types with CO2, and we see the scale or rates of mineral precipitation, their reactions with CO2. So where they occur in very, very restricted areas where we have collision of the plates, and where this deep mantle is brought to the surface. So, for example, in the geologically recent collision, this is the trend where we can find some of these rocks. So only along this trend, not everywhere else. And not everywhere there, because in some places it's deeper down. But look at the Kazakhstan. These two colors here, they are showing actually these ophiolites and ophiolites with some crust itself. So we are totally blessed by their nature. So it's not only that it's there, but everywhere in drainage systems of these rocks, we should expect rock fragments in the reservoirs. And these rock fragments should act as natural catalysts. So this is what we are looking for. Now we have some donated cores from Condor Petroleum. So they are Triassic age, but they were in their drainage system. We went to Chrome Tau. So this is the big chromite mine, which is basically an ophiolite. So these are some exposures of pyroxene in Tau, which is west of Almaty. So with that, now I really like to invite Saber, and Saber will talk to you about his aims and his research about this mineral trapping.
Thank you, Dr. Milvan. Hello, everyone. Happy to see you. Okay. Okay. As Dr. Milvan previously mentioned, for CO2 storage, we inject CO2 in the reservoir, and the CO2, we have a porous media, and in this porous media, CO2 is trapped. We have 4 trapping mechanisms, but 3 of them, in fact, CO2 is in gas, liquid, or supercritical phase. Because of that, we have the problem of leakage. To solve this problem, we have mineral trapping. In mineral trapping, the CO2 is, converted to the solid phase. But there is a problem about mineral trapping. As you can see, it takes 10,000 years. It is more than life, and we couldn't wait for this time to see that mineral trapping is the dominant mechanism. What we want to do, is to accelerate mineral trapping. But there are some issues. The first one is related to the reservoir. When CO2 is injected, considering here from this well, it is injected into the reservoir. There is a problem that because of the gravity difference, CO2 tends to go to the topmost layers, and CO2 solubility is really slow. And after a couple of years, because of pressure and diffusion, CO2 goes to the water phase and dissolved in it. And because of convective mixing, some fingers are produced, and these fingers are extended till we reach the maximum solubility in the reservoir. So the first problem is about the CO2 solubility. The second problem is related to geochemical reactions. When CO2, consider a situation, the CO2 dissolved in water, after that pH decreases, and because of this pH decrease, we have dissolution of minerals. But you know, in ordinary sedimentary formations, the rate of this dissolution is really slow. But in ultramorphic formations, the rate is really, in fact, really high, and we have reactive minerals. How we want to see this problem? We have two methods to evaluate and assess this problem. First of all, we do some experiments. The most important experiment is related to batch reaction. We have a pressure vessel. Consider this one. We put our rock powder, then we fill it with water, and we pressurize it with CO2. And before and after exposure to CO2, we do water and rock mineral analysis. Then in the next step, we need to do simulation. I should note that initially, before doing experiments, also we do some experimental design, because you know that whenever we want to do experiments, we don't know how long does it take for mineral dissolution. So we do some geochemical simulation for this purpose. It helps us to know how long this does it take. We get the data from the literature, but after doing experiments, we modify our model using, in fact, we verify our model, and we obtain some variables such as reaction rate constants and reactive surface area. And then whenever we have a modified model and verified model, we do forecasting. For this purpose, as you can see, this is the mole concentration, in fact, the concentration of ions. As we previously mentioned, some divalent cations are released. As you can see, whenever the divalent cations increases in the media, the pH increases, and because of that, aragonite, which is a kind of carbonate, is produced. Then in the next section, what we did till now was in a batch reactor, and we didn't have any porous media. Now we want to do everything in the porous media. For that purpose, we do simulation. And reservoir simulation is done for this purpose. It gives us some information about how long does it take for different different trapping mechanisms, especially mineral trapping. Also, it gives us some information about the effect of mineralization on different parameters such as injectivity, fluid flow, and storage capacity. It is, you know, really important for us to know that how much CO2 is stored finally. Now, I want to show you some of our simulation results. For instance, here, during the injection, we want to see how CO2 solubility changes. At the beginning, CO2 solubility was around 0. The red color shows this. And after injection starts, we can see that CO2 goes to the topmost layers. And the main reason behind this is the gravity difference. And as you can see, the color changes to green. And then after that, whenever the injection stops, as you can see again, CO2 goes to topmost layers, and some fingers, because of CO2 solubility and convective mixing, in fact, happens. And because of that, you can see the CO2 solubility in the porous media increases. Now, I want to give the floor to Dr. Milwan again.
So basically, I think that we convinced you that Kazakhstan geology is very favorable for all known decarbonization geosolution technologies, and that developing domestic expertise may allow Kazakhstan to become a true global leader in decarbonization. So with that, I finish my talk. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you, Professor Fusic, for your very nice presentation. I think Professor Murtazavi. Садись. Next presentation by Professor Ali Murtazali. Please welcome. And before you start, I will just say a few words on Russian. Почему мы...
Why we give these presentations today? That's our traditional climate talk audience. Because in Kazakhstan, we always talk about and saying, let's buy something, let's buy here, let's buy there. But if we don't have the fundamental understanding what we need, and we can get this fundamental understanding only if we have science, and then we'll be able to not only buy technologies, but develop them locally in Kazakhstan. So scientific presentations may be hard for you, but they are necessary. We talk about the real things that are already implemented in the world.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my presentation on the topic is investigation of fault activation mechanisms and caprock integrity in carbon CO2 storage. With regard to the significance of this issue in developing countries such as Kazakhstan, and with the background that you have, and you've had the presentations that you heard so far. So this is a bit more on the technical aspect and the significance of CO2 storage. The significance of project, a recent global projection by Global CCS Institute estimates that around 5.6 gigatons of CO2 will need to be captured and stored annually by 2050, a more than 100-fold increase from today. To achieve this level, the number of industrial-scale geological sites will have to increase to several thousands worldwide, each of which will require decade-long injection of CO2 at levels of hundreds of thousands to a few million tons per year. Major steps involved in CCS and CO2 capture are basically the capture of CO2, transport, and storage. With an increase in demand for CCS and the number of CO2 storage sites, there is a need for better understanding of mechanisms involved in CO2 storage to enable the assessment of the risk associated with CO2 leakage. CO2 can be stored in saline aquifers, depleted oil and gas reservoirs for enhanced oil recovery, unminable coal seams, or other porous foundation. With regard to the size of the Kazakhstan, the potential that the country has for CO2 storage, if you look at in east, you've got many underground mines under operation toward depletion. So there's significant underground openings there, have the potential for CO2 storage. If you come to central Kazakhstan, Karaganda region, a lot of coal deposits. The ones that are not feasible to mine have potential for CO2 storage. If you go to West Kazakhstan, that's the source of most Kazakh petroleum reservoirs. And Kazakhstan, the life of petroleum in Kazakhstan is not too long. So those reservoirs are toward depletion, and there is significant potential for CO2 storage in those reservoirs. So it is really worthwhile to start some fundamental research on the mechanisms involved in CO2. We have initiated a small project to look at one aspect of the storage, but I think this is a project at the national level. If there are any government officials here, I would like to draw their attention to this subject. Many developing nations, North America, Canada, USA, European countries, they have been storing CO2 for many years, but they're still spending millions of dollars on research on this topic. So I think with regard to the potential that Kazakhstan has, that significant funding and attention should be paid to this subject. The general condition for underground storage are a geologic formation or structure in which CO2 can be stored. Could be any porous rock formation, a caprock layer formation with low permeability to seal the storage, because we want CO2 inject underground at a depth of over 1,000. We want to make sure that it will stay there for thousands of years. So it is an expensive process. If there is any leakage to the surface and CO2 finds its way to atmosphere, then the whole resources is waste. So this caprock integrity is a major aspects of geomechanic aspects of this CO2 storage. Sufficient overburden or depth to provide enough confining pressure to incarcerate the stored fluid and provide the supercritical state for CO2. The leakage potential of CO2 from the storage site is the most risk-prone element. Major sources of CO2 leakage are from the wellbore damage, caprock fracturing and breach, and leakage through faults or major discontinuities that are within the reservoir region. So this is the focus of the research project that we have initiated. It was funded jointly by Chevron and NU. It's a preliminary project. It's a small project, as I said, but this is the first step to be taken in Kazakhstan from a geomechanical design aspect of this subject. The focus of our research is the fault activation aspect of the CO2 storage. To safely store carbon dioxide, it is vital to ensure the integrity of the caprock, which may have major discontinuities such as fault or joints. So reactivation of major the pre-existing discontinuity as fault is a dominant caprock breach mechanism that affects the hydraulic integrity of the storage site and potential leakage mechanism. This is a schematic view of like a reservoir, as you could see here. And this is the fault or discontinuity that exists at varying scale. Obviously, the environmental issues associated with CO2 storage is not just the leakage. If the pressure level goes high, it can create fault slip, it can lead to seismicity, generates earthquake, and these are environmental drawbacks that we can expect from CO2 storage. So here, once you inject CO2 at high pressure, you can cause slip along this discontinuity. It generates seismic waves similar to natural earthquake, but not that big. We're looking in worst case scenario, like a 4 magnitude Richter scale that can cause vibration to surface structures and damage them. These are different leakage potential. As you could see, this is once again hypothetical CO2 storage. These are faults or discontinuity, and CO2 can migrate towards surface and leak into the atmosphere. These are injection faults. One dominant major issue is the activation of these faults or discontinuities that can provide leakage paths to the surface and create environmental problems. This is one of the conceptual examples of this. That's fault magnified. So within the reservoir, we can have Dalton slip, and then at the upper horizon within the caprock, we can sort of seismic slip, not like earthquake prone as such, but they can create vibration and cause leakage to the surface. These are interesting studies by satellite monitoring from the Insala project in Algeria. This site is one of the best documented CO2 storage site in Algeria. Many international research teams working on it. And this is the area that we are looking at, the order of 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer. So they are injecting at the depths of about 800 meter for many years, and this is the ground surface movement, the contours. You could see the road, the red zone is the uplift, so-called lobes, and this is the major regional fault or discontinuity. So here we are looking into 1 to 2 millimeter upheaval of the ground surface as a function of CO2 storage pressure. So this is the sort of thing that we want to do for Kazakhstan. To be honest, in the stage that I was writing the proposal submission, the interview that we had, I wish we had the opportunity to do this research for a local Kazakh site. Apparently, there was a candidate site. We asked for the information. Once we heard that the information is confidential, and then once again from another source, I heard that they have changed the site. So it it is sad that if there is such a site, if there is such a data, we cannot use it because it's geological information. It's nothing confidential. It's an empty, depleted reservoir. We just want to see, is it suitable for CO2 storage or not? So if there are officials here, I would like to hear if there is any site, if they can share any data, because it's a pity. We are going to do a sophisticated three-dimensional modeling, and we have to use data from Algeria, from Canada, from other countries, from Switzerland. Obviously, they have done research, but we need some data for verification for the research that we intend to do. So this is the core of our topic: investigation of fault activation mechanism in carbon storage. We want to develop some computational methodologies or tool to assess this fault activation mechanism. You know, the scale of the project is big. You cannot do experiment. Even if you do, is not realistic. What you have in situ, in field, is completely different. It is almost impossible to simulate the process experimentally at the lab scale. So the cheapest, the best way is to go for advanced computational tools such as numerical. We have that capability. We are trying to initiate that, and hopefully we can produce some quantitative design charts as a function of variation in storage site parameters. So in stage one, we are going through different well-documented sites: Mount Terry site in Switzerland, in Salah, Algeria, and 2 sites in France. Look what they have done, what data they have produced. I wish we could have access to that Kazakh site if there is one. And then for the selected site, we want to characterize the host rock, the geology, geotechnical parameters, build the geotechnical model, determine rock mass design parameters, build a 3D model of the storage site, and try to simulate the CO2 storage process, and then compare the results with the observations that they have and sort of calibrate our model. So this is a schematic just with the issues that we want to focus. Once again, if this is a storage site, as you could see, the reservoir, and if there is a fault. So if you inject too much at high pressure levels, then you're going to cause a slip on this fault. So if this fault can reach to the surface, then CO2 can find its way through this fault to the surface and come back to the atmosphere. Whereas we plan to keep it here for at least 1,000 years. So what we want to do to look into effect of change in fault permeability as a function of slip, because the permeability changes as you have movement on discontinuity. Also, permeability changes as a function of confinement, depending on what depth you are. What is the ratio of in situ stress, regional in situ stress? It is interesting to note that Kazakhstan is such a big country, huge mining potential, huge petroleum. There is not even one single measurement of in situ stress, which is probably the most designed parameters. I've suggested to the mining industry, to the petroleum, but that's a key parameter that you need for CO2 storage, because on this fault, if you have high horizontal stress, the story will be different. If you have high vertical, will be different if it is hydrostatic. So these are some key aspects that affect the whole process. And this is what I'm saying: at the national level, the government, major industries, mining, petroleum should join together and try to plan the decent research projects. So these are the aspect. The other aspect is changing fault geometry, fault depth, reservoir ratio. Other aspect, we want to do a mechanistic study within a 3-dimensional modeling domain and try to produce some sort of qualitative design charts. This is just like some further info. I'll skip through some on faults. You're not like these are too technical, but this is just a fault or fracture zone that can be located within the reservoir, and then that can provide a leakage paths for the CO2 if you inject beyond the higher pressure level. As I said, the other issue is the effect of in situ stress. We want to have a look at it, do a parametric study. What stress regime Kazakhstan has, we don't know. There is no data, honestly. If I go to underground Kazakh mines, I see the failure underground, I can guess something, but there is no measurement. There is no measurement. I suggest to officials in Kazakh. I think petroleum industry, they have a lot of wellbore stability problem. They drill wellbore, extract petroleum, and then they have failure. They don't know what it is, and then they go spend millions of dollars and drill another wellbore 500 meters away. So this is for CO2 storage, one key component of data we need. So we're going to do a parametric study, see how it affects the process. In stage 2, we want to do a thorough 3D stress analysis of the storage site. As I said, we're going to select a candidate site. The following key aspects that affect the process: true triaxial state of stress, fault geometry, fault shear stress properties, fault geometry and influence on the local stress field, and caprock stress field are the goal of our research to work on. Once we have developed the model, we want to do a comprehensive parametric study. What if the parameter is not? What if we've had so much error in estimating host rock deformation modulus, in situ stress ratio, etc., etc. And then we want to compile all these data in the form of practical design charts that can be used as an aid in the design and analysis of CO2 storage projects within Kazakhstan and worldwide globally, hopefully. That's conclude my presentation. If there is any question.